Welcome to the July 2019 episode of the Cerini Nonprofit Connection, a podcast designed to bring unique insight to the nonprofit sector. Our guest today is Danette O'Connell, CEO of Triumph International Consulting. Welcome, Danette.
Thank you for having me, Ken.
No problem. Got a question for you to start.
Okay.
Why don't you share a little bit about how Triumph works with the nonprofit sector and what you do for the sector?
Okay, so we help nonprofits grow, and we do this in many ways. And we help them analyze their nonprofits, their process and procedures, their finances, and also their technology to become more efficient.
Okay, so when you say you help nonprofits grow, what do you mean by helping them grow? How do you help them grow?
So we do a growth plan to see we can grow them with revenue. We can help them with their staffing. We can help them with their programs, go into different sectors. So there's many do mergers. So there's many ways that we can do that, but we primarily do it through a growth plan.
So when you talk about a growth plan, how is a growth plan different from, let's say, a strategic plan?
So a strategic plan is overall, this is where we are now, and this is where we want to get to in 5 years, not necessarily growing. And a growth plan is concentrated on growth. So this is where we are now. This is where we want to be in 3 years, and we want to increase our revenue by X amount. And this is how we're going to get there. Are we going to go to different industries? Are we going to hire new employees? So it includes all of that, but it's really focused on growth.
So when you think about for-profit businesses, obviously for-profit businesses, my business, we're very growth oriented and focused on growth. Typically, when you think about nonprofit organizations, it's more about the delivery of service and program accomplishments and impact and those types of things, not always necessarily about growth. Why is growth important for the nonprofit sector as opposed to, or maybe in conjunction with some of those other things?
So it's important to grow, to be competitive. So it's becoming more competitive in the nonprofit world. So we look to grow nonprofits so that they can become competitive. For instance, with USAID. USAID funding, used to be that they would fund smaller nonprofits, and that has changed. What they've done is taken the money and given it to larger nonprofits, and it's supposed to trickle down to the smaller nonprofits. We know that that doesn't work, and it hasn't worked. So nonprofits need to be bigger to compete against that. So you need to be around the $10 million mark.
Is that really the sweet spot, $10 million?
It is. So that's what we have seen. So that may change in the future. This is something new in the last 3 years. So hopefully it'll get further down, but right now that's about the spot. So for a nonprofit who focuses on USAID money and that needs money from the USAID, they need to grow. And they can do this in many different ways. And their programs are important to deliver them, but let's make the programs bigger. So they also go out and compete for other funding because of the USAID, that they're not being able to get it.
So does that then, when you say compete for other funding, is that within the context of their mission? Or because I see a lot of organizations, they go after funding and that funding might not necessarily fit exactly into their mission, and they kind of try to find ways to plug that in to make it fit, and you get a certain level of mission creep and everything else.
Yeah, I see nonprofits do that. That's not healthy. Stay with their mission and drive forward. And that's that's one of the things that I really focus on when they grow, that you have to stay true to your mission and not go after funding just to get funding. So you have to stay with your mission and not say, oh, okay, well, unless you have a plan on going to different sectors or to different programs or growing the scope of your programs, that's fine. But you have to have a plan. You can't just go out and say, oh, okay, well, let's go out and get different funding.
So let's talk about how we go about developing a growth plan.
Okay.
So what does a growth plan look like? What does an organization need to do to create this growth plan?
So they first need to engage their board. The executive director has to be on board, and the whole office needs to be involved. It's not just a higher up decision, because everybody in the office has to pull their own weight to be able to execute on this growth plan. But The executive director and board really has to be on board. So once they say, okay, we need to do this, because at first it can stretch the resources within the organization. So what they do is once they have decided to do that, then they bring someone like me in to create it. So the one thing nice about bringing someone from the outside in is that they look at things differently from internally. So, I go in there and I analyze their finances, their process and procedures, their all their technology, their efficiencies, their staffing, everything. And then decide, okay, this is what I found. Here are some holes that we need to plug first. You have to have a solid foundation before you can grow. So then I
So,
create.
so it's creating that appropriate infrastructure as a starting point. So if I've got the
Correct.
right infrastructure, then I can grow off that infrastructure.
Without a doubt.
Okay.
But you have to have the solid foundation. It's like building a house. You have to have a solid foundation before you can start building.
Okay.
So then once we do that, then we create a plan. And the plan is, this is where we are right now. And this is how we want to grow. And how we want to do it. Do we want to do it by expanding our programs, by going to different sectors, to going to a merger? There's just several different ways that you can slice and dice this. So, and also a fee for service. People don't realize that there's a lot of, you know, benefits to doing a fee for service. One, it gives you a recurring revenue, which stabilizes a nonprofit. So I look at all of those. And if they do a fee for service, what is your margins and can I increase those margins? So I take them through this whole entire plan, and I also project manage it out. So I have a list of who's going to do what, and then I have a timeline that we're going to do it. And then it triggers each person to be able to do their part in it. And I try to, allow everybody in the organization to be involved because they want to be involved. And I communicate every step of the way so that everybody understands what's going on, they understand their roles in it, and also to create security that no one's losing their job through this. It's just, everybody needs to be involved and to make them comfortable with the plan.
So basically, you're creating accountability so that people know what roles they have to play, and they know what they have to get done in terms of, because obviously if somebody drops the ball in one place, it's going to have a major impact on the entire plan.
Exactly. And that's why it's really important to project manage any plan. If it's a strategic plan or if it's a growth plan, they should all be project managed out, because too many people create these plans and then they sit on the shelf because they don't know how to execute on them. So when you project manage them out, then everybody knows their accountability. And then, Sally could have part A and Joe could have part B, but he can't start his until Sally's done. So it sets an alarm off via email to let Joe know that, hey, Sally's done with her part, I can move forward now. And so it really keeps everybody on track and keeps everybody accountable for what their roles are into the plan.
So how often are you reviewing the progress on this? Is this like a daily sort of thing that happens, or is it
A weekly?
Weekly, okay.
Yeah. And some people are good. They have good internal staff. So they take it, and sometimes it's every 2 weeks, but I don't like to go longer than every 2 weeks, because if you do, then if they get off track, it's harder if you wait a month, where if it's only 2 weeks, I can get everybody back on track.
Okay. And obviously every organization is going to be different. So every organization's growth plan is going to be different.
Correct.
So when I look at an organization, that's kind of focused in maybe one funding stream, they may take a growth plan one direction, and then one that's in a different funding stream may take a different type of growth plan. So obviously there's no one size fits all, but so
No.
how do you decide, or how do you work with the management team and the board to determine what is the appropriate strategy for them?
So after I analyze their business, because basically I take everything apart and look under the hood and put it all back together, and then I make my suggestions from there. And there is no one size fits all. And so what I do is I make my recommendations to the board on my findings, and we may tweak those, and they may like, no, we don't want to go that direction, we want to go this direction. So they change. And also, as a strategic plan, a growth plan is the same as it's a working document. And they may change as we go, because we may go down one road and it becomes a dead end, or it becomes too much of an obstacle to go down. So then we have to change tracks and go a different way. So that's one of the things that's helpful to have me there. Then I can just, divert them a different direction.
So either you have to have a tremendous level of expertise about all the different funding streams, or you have to be able to rely on management's understanding of the different funding streams in order to be able to assist you in terms of determining the direction that things are moving in. Because if 3 years ago you were trying to build Medicaid service coordination, you'd be shit out of luck right now because it no longer exists.
Yeah.
So I mean, how do you
Yeah.
of gain a good understanding of the direction that the industry and the different funding streams are moving in order to be able to help management with their growth plan?
So if it's an industry that I'm not familiar with, then I do a lot of research, and I do take a little bit of their guidance and a whole lot of their guidance to see if it's, especially if it's an industry that I don't know. But I educate myself also. I take their lead and the board's lead, and I take all of that information plus my research that I've done, and I really dig in really deep, especially if it's medical, because that is one area that I'm not an expertise in. Doesn't mean that I can't do it, because there's a lot of industries I've gone into that I'm not an expert in. So, but
as long as you understand how business operates and you understand processes and stuff like that, you can always make a difference.
Business is business, and it doesn't make a difference. The fundamentals are there, and you go down the same process.
I find that in a lot of organizations, nonprofit leadership isn't necessarily forward thinking. They kind of get bogged down in what's happening today, and they kind of spin in the world of crisis management. How do you help organizations pull out of the whole crisis management type of mentality and move towards that future growth or future thought process?
So after I do my analysis, I try to get them really excited about the future. And that really helps them to think forward. And once we start brainstorming, then they start becoming very creative. And, oh, yeah, we can do it this way and we can do it that way. They can think of the ideas. I figure out how to solve it. So if they say, okay, we'd love to grow, say, for instance, hey, we'd love to do a merger. And after I've talked to them and say, okay, here's the benefits, here's the, the benefits of growing and doing the merger, then they'll be like, oh, okay, but we don't know how to do it. And I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. That's what I'm here for. But getting them excited and to think that way is very important to get them to go there. So not always the easiest task in the world. So
yeah, no, I agree. And I think, if you can provide information to the sector, and I think that's one of the big places where the sector maybe falls a little on its face. There's information out there, and everybody understands that information, or the flow of information, is kind of the lifeblood of any business, not just a nonprofit organization. What do you do, and how do you go about determining the right information to capture so that nonprofits can utilize that information effectively in terms of really driving results? So, I mean, I'm assuming that things like dashboards and all those types of things are things that you're helping nonprofits to establish and set up as part of this process.
Without a doubt. So what I do is I go out and do a lot of homework and a lot of research on that industry. And then I determine, which way do we want to move and grow, and what is important to put on that dashboard. So for instance, if you have grants, like I track every grant and the cost of the grant. A lot of people don't think that that's important to know, but it's very important to know. So what I do is I put each one of the grants on the dashboard, where they are, how much are they burning through the money, how fast are they burning through the money. Then also I say, okay, where are you, year to date on your finances, and put that on a dashboard, and then put what their cash balances are. And also, if we're growing at this point, if we do have a growth plan, on where we are in the growth plan, versus where we said we were going to be, where are we? So there's a lot. And it's nice to have a dashboard because it's a quick and easy way to look at it and be like, oh, okay, this is where we are in the process. And I do this also with the project managing. So I let everybody know, and I bring it up on a screen and let everyone know where we are in the process and are we on track. And if we fell behind, why did we fall behind? So it's really important to keep track of those.
You've talked about a lot of different strategies. Do you mind maybe giving a quick little case study? You don't have to use names of organizations, but just a quick little case study so people can kind of get a feel for, what you're talking about in terms of, what a growth plan could look like and what types of strategies organizations could be taking. And we'll get to more on mergers and acquisitions later. I'll ask you a whole bunch of questions.
Oh yeah, no worries. So when I go into an organization, what the first thing I do is look at their finances. And I open up their books and look at everything and do some analysis on what the income is versus the expenses and what their operational costs are. So those are the three big buckets that I worry about. Then I look at their operations. What are their technologies doing? And how can we become more efficient? If they're a global organization, because I focus mainly on global organizations, not that I don't do domestic, but I do have the background of international organizations, then I look at all of the locations and how they're doing and what processes they have in place. Then I look at HR, and I interview every staff member.
Okay.
What are you doing? Do you like what you're doing? And where do you want to be in the future? So if we do create a growth plan, I can take that into consideration of where we put each of the staff members as we grow. If they want to move up the corporate ladder per se, then okay, well, I have this person that can do this.
Do you also make an assessment as to whether the people actually have the capabilities to do their job?
Yes, without a doubt.
Okay.
And I do the assessment of what they're currently doing, how well they're doing it, and do they have the capability of moving where they want to move. So I do all of those analyses. Then I put all of that together and come up with recommendations. And if they want to grow, then I do an assessment on the industry itself. So if it's mental health, then I look at that and say, okay, how can we, where is the mental health industry now? Where do we want to grow that? How many people are out there? How many nonprofits are out there doing mental health? Because sometimes the industry gets saturated. And then I also look at their governance, because that's very important, and their board, and how is their board functioning, and is it a good functioning board? And do we need to grow the board? Because sometimes that is an option, to grow the board if they don't have a lot of board members that are helping raise money, or we need more board members to raise money, then sometimes we grow the board. And so that's also something that I look at. So there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of things that I look at and make sure that everything is done properly and correctly. And if it's not, then we fix those kind of things.
So there are two things, more than two things, but two things in particular that came up.
Okay.
One of the things that we're seeing out there in the marketplace is lack of discretionary funding. It seems like everybody these days wants to give organizations money that are utilized specific for purposes. And even when you're getting government funding, there's not enough money to cover administrative costs. You got Executive Order 38, which is putting limitations on administrative spending. You're getting new federal guidelines that are going to push more and more towards performance-based contracts and everything else. So, what are organizations doing, and how are you helping organizations to kind of look at that whole administrative component of things and try to figure out where that extra discretionary funding is going to come from, especially with the high level of competition?
Right. So especially operational costs, as you mentioned, is a huge problem because a lot of grants don't cover it. So how do you cover it? A lot of it can be, you need unrestricted funds, which they can do fundraisers, which now fundraising has just really changed. So we need the board to do fundraising, or you need to do events to do fundraising. Or you can just do online auctions. A lot of people are starting to do that to help with the unrestricted funds. Or there are some, not too many, and I've researched these, Some foundations that do fund unrestricted.
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
And even if they do fund, they don't fund long term. They'll fund a year or two and that'll be it. And they're looking for self-sustainability. They're not looking for ongoing. So they may give you some technology money, or they may give you something for infrastructure or those types of things, but they're not going to give you ongoing administrative support. It just doesn't happen.
For the most part, you're correct. Yes, yes. So, and that's why you really have to think outside the box. And a lot of people are going away from galas. And
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work and not a lot of return on investment there. So a lot of people are doing house cocktail parties with the board. They're doing cocktail parties instead of dinners, which is good. They're doing online auctions. Like, there's a lot of different creative ways that nonprofits are creating to do that.
Right.
So
the other question that kind of popped up is, you said you work with international, not exclusively, but with international. And when you're dealing with international, there's obviously the need to understand the different international rules, because every country is going to have different rules and regulations. There's the need to, as you said, develop processes, because if I'm dealing with an organization that has, multiple sites, the further we get away from the corporate headquarters, the more we seem to have a breakdown in those processes. So you're in a situation where, if you're dealing with something over in Israel or Germany, or even something out in California with the corporate headquarters here, how do you manage that type of stuff? And how do you ensure that the tone and everything else that's been established at corporate kind of find their way over to those more remote locations?
A lot of research. So whenever you're dealing, it doesn't make a difference what country or even what state, to your point. There's always different rules, predominantly in other countries. So I've worked in a lot of countries in Africa, and each country is different and each culture is different. And so not only do you have to learn the law there, but you have to learn the culture, and you have to learn the law on the HR side. You have to learn the law on the finance side, because some countries are very, very strict. Like Nepal is very strict with their money. You can send it there, but you can't get it out. So once you send money there, that's it. So you just have to learn, and really the culture is important, because if you're implementing new process and procedures, the staff there is involved, especially HR, because they're very particular about how they're being treated. And so you have to be sensitive to that, whenever you're creating policies, and regardless if it's an HR policy or a financial policy. And like I said, each country is a little different. And even when I'm growing organizations and I want to take them into a new country, I do the research to see, can I take this organization to this country? What would be the benefits? And making sure that I've done all my homework. I've researched their laws inside and out, primarily on HR and finances. Like, they're the two that are really big. So I go and I do those researches to make sure that that it's capable of even growing to those countries.
So some of the countries that you're talking about in Africa and Tibet and everything, where it's hard to get money back out, when you're talking about growth, you're talking about programmatic growth, but that doesn't necessarily mean a corresponding increase in revenue coming into the organization within those countries. So how do you kind of deal with the revenue has to be raised here, or what?
No. So the one thing that you can do is, whenever you're growing internationally, you can have your headquarters office here in the United States, and you can create a entity there, which is an arm here in the United States. Then you can create a local NGO and connect the two of them. So, and what the benefit of this is doing is, the funds that are being raised in the United States, you can send to, let's just say, one of the countries I worked in was Uganda. So I can send the money to Uganda, but let's create a local entity so that they can get local funding, because their local funding, they're not going to give to an INGO, which is an international nonprofit or non-government organization. So they want to give to a local one. So that's one of the ways that you can expand an international nonprofit, is by creating this NGO and going after the local funding. Not only that, when you create the local entity, then you can partner with different nonprofits and the NGOs within their countries. And then you can create more funding, you can go after more funding. And I've worked with an organization here that has done that. We've gone in and we've created partnerships in different countries throughout Africa, so that you create this consortium of organizations that can help each other go after different funding. They can go after USAID, we can go after local.
So it was really a collaboration of already existing organizations as opposed to setting up a network of new organizations.
It could be both.
Okay.
It can be both. If you're local there anyways, and you're doing the work, they normally know who you are, because they keep track of all INGOs. And so whenever you create this local one.
I keep wanting to throw a B in front of that, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Bingo. So we can, so then that you can work with them, and there's different fundings that you can go after. And sometimes they come to us and say, hey, you know what, we have this grant and we know you do this work. Can you create a nonprofit to do it? Because they cannot, majority of them cannot give to INGOs. So there are some exceptions to that. If they're a global organization themselves, they can. But other than that, like the UN Women, they can do that. But that's like, they have to be a national or international organization to be able to give to an INGO.
All right, so let's get back to maybe something a little more granular.
Okay.
One of the things that you talked about was the board, and how it's important to get the board involved in the process. One of the things, though, that I see is that in a lot of organizations, you have the board kind of sitting in one spot, and you have management in the organization sitting in a different spot, and you have this communication that takes place back and forth, but it's really not a lot of shared thinking and shared thought process between the two in terms of direction and focus of the organization. The board pretty much relies on management to report, and then if nothing gets reported, then they go home and they say, all right, nothing to report. I mean, how do you get the board to kind of maybe pull some of this information, maybe have the board take some of that strategic lead in the process, so that it's not just management who's feeding the board, but it's really the board who's kind of initiating some of this process?
Yeah, so what I've done is, I think it's really important for any board to be extremely engaged in the nonprofits. So what I've done is make sure that I report everything to them, but also ask them to get involved and help in these tasks. Review the documents that we're moving forward and give their comments to the, like, let's just say a growth plan or a strategic plan, whichever one they're doing, and give them tasks. So create different committees. So let's have normally they always have a finance committee. So have the finance committee look at the finance documents. So I tried to engage them so that it's a two-way street.
But that's already taking into consideration that you've been hired, or
True.
someone like you has been hired. You got to get to that spot first.
Yeah, exactly.
And in order to get to that spot, you need to have buy-in by the board and buy-in by management. You kind of need to have that, collaboration between the two sides. And again, we read board minutes all the time. We work with several hundred nonprofit organizations. We read board minutes all the time. There's not a lot of, unless they have a separate strategic planning meeting that they have outside. In a lot of the board meetings that we, look at the minutes and stuff, there's not a lot of this strategic discussion happening at the board meetings. So again, how do you get that, or how do you foster a different thought process at the board level so that strategic thinking is happening at the board level? And, how does management kind of help to implement some of that stuff by putting things on agendas to kind of force focus in these areas.
That's exactly how you do it. So you create it and also give them all the benefits to whatever you're presenting. If it's a growth plan, then you put that forward, and then put it on the agenda and talk about whatever the topic is, and try to get them engaged and get their buy-in on the whatever the topic shall be. So it's really important to get them engaged, but it is hard to get them forward thinking, especially if they're not already. So, but I think that it's just a matter of talking to them and talking it through on the plan.
Okay. Now, I said we'd come back to mergers and acquisition because you've mentioned that on several occasions. You're in a situation, I find, in today's marketplace where organizations have to really start looking at themselves realistically and kind of looking and saying, am I a buyer or a seller? Am I in a situation where, based on where I am organizationally, do I have the ability to grow, as you're talking about here, developing a growth plan and moving forward as an organization, with the infrastructure I already have in place, with the resources I have in place, with the direction that my funding streams are moving in and everything else, such as the implementation of managed care and all that other stuff? Or am I a buyer, where I do have this network already established, I do have my funds in place, I do have good infrastructure and everything else? How does an organization make the determination whether they're a buyer or a seller? Should every organization be looking at all times as to whether they should be thinking about mergers? This should be a regular conversation that takes place. How does all this work?
So I think that it's new to nonprofits to do a merger. When you think of mergers, you think of mergers and acquisitions for profits, not nonprofits. So a lot of nonprofits aren't even aware that this even goes on. So I think it's important for nonprofits to understand it's a very involved situation. You can be a buyer or a seller. And the way that you determine that is by doing a full analysis of the organization and see what the stability of the organization is. Are you on some organizations, they're financially not doing too well and they're a little unstable, and so they just lost more funding and they're on the scared side.
Well, the problem I find is that you got a lot of these organizations that they wait until they've got one foot in the grave before they realize, hey, wait a minute, I got to do something here. And by then it's too late, because who wants someone who's, already given up the ghost?
Yeah, and sometimes that does get it's always, like they say, go out and get money when you don't need it, so it's that kind of a situation. You should be thinking before your company's or your organization is going down. But I say it's never too late, but you should be looking way before the organization gets in trouble, because then you're not attractive to anybody.
I agree. I mean, you want to, when you go after or get involved in some level of merger acquisition, you want to do it from a position of power, a position of strength. And you want to be able to choose your partner, not have your partner choose you, because, you don't want to be the ugly guy at the dance who nobody wants to dance with. You want to,
sit you in the corner.
So you want to be in that situation where, you do have the ability to make some decisions and have people fight over you.
Right, without a doubt. And it can be that situation where, people could be fighting over you. Once you let everyone know, hey, I'm up for this and I'm willing to merge with another organization, you can go out there and research several different organizations. So once you have done all your homework and you've gotten to the place where, okay, I want to merge with another organization. So am I a buyer or am I a seller? So you can be either. So, and sometimes it determines on who the other side is. Sometimes you're like, oh, this other organization would be perfect. So there's normally two types of organizations that you would merge with. One that's similar to you, or one that's complementary to you. So if they're complementary either way, you go and you look at, okay, who's my competitors? Who does the exact same thing that I do? So those could be an option. or someone who does similar. So I just did a merger where one was in the mental health and one was in human rights, and they complemented each other.
So
So
this comes down to the vertical or horizontal integration. So
correct.
Horizontal integration would be expanding your footprint. So that's getting involved with a similar organization that's doing the same stuff you are, but in maybe a different area to kind of create a larger organization.
Correct.
And the other one, vertical, would be if I've got complementary where I provide certain services to a population, you provide other services to the same population, but by putting them together, the population's better served.
Correct,
Okay.
without a doubt. And you become a competitive organization because you have just grown. One of the fears that a lot of nonprofits face is what's going to happen to, we have 2 executive directors, then we have double the staff, and we're going to have to lay people off. So that's not always necessary. And because the work doesn't change, it's just you become one, and the hardest one is the executive directors. Sometimes
and the board.
And the board. The board's easier though, because you can create one big board.
Well, it depends whether there's still founders involved and whether there's founder syndrome and all that other stuff.
And I have dealt with that also. And the founders took a seat on the board, which is fine. So that one's a little bit easier. Sometimes the executive director of the organization that's being absorbed decides, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to retire. Sometimes it's just because the executive director is, which is why they're on the market of merging, is because the executive director is going to be no longer. And it's time to, instead of getting a new one, it's time to just merge.
I think you're going to see more of that in the next 15 years or so as you're seeing a graying of the executive directors. So there is a lot of executive directors that are over the next 10 to 15 years going to be retiring. And it's either going to be, creating some level of succession plan with, new management, or again, finding a way to kind of merge into another organization.
Right. And even all the other positions, normally you can find people a new position, or just merge the 2 into one. So there's, that is the scary part on both sides of the organization. And so whenever you tell your staff that you're going to merge, it's a very delicate situation that you have to take, and telling them, because this can be one of the crossroads that could get very sticky.
I mean, I find that the biggest issue within a merger is corporate culture. And it's trying to blend different corporate cultures that are coming from 2 separate organizations, because not every organization is the same. So if I have to, one that has a corporate culture of A and one that has a corporate culture of F, and you're trying to push the 2 of them together, it doesn't always work. From a benefits perspective, from a contract perspective, from all the different pieces, and then again, how the people interact and everything else. It's not always easy.
No, and it is not easy, and especially the organization that is the surviving entity. It's always, well, we do it this way. We do it this way. And the other one's like, well, no, we do it this way. And so you get a lot of that, and it does become a little difficult. And sometimes people jump ship just because they don't want to be involved in it. So, so you just got to take all of those. There's a lot to take into consideration when doing a merger. And
what do you see as maybe the 5 things you've learned over time with mergers that typically go wrong, that you could kind of give some people advice as to, hey, watch out for these 5 items or 3 items or whatever? Sorry, I don't mean to throw you in the spot.
No. I'm just thinking, definitely staffing and the staffing culture. Make sure that you do it very delicately. Make sure that you get all of the information. Look at the other entities' books and make sure that you have analyzed them as much as you can.
So that through a due diligence process. Okay.
A very extensive due diligence process. Know what you're getting into before you get into it. As you mentioned, the boards, especially when you have founders, it can be very difficult. It can become a roller coaster. So because founders, this is, their organization is very close to them and it's personal. And normally, as a lot of nonprofits are started through tragedy of one or another thing. So it's dear to their heart and they don't want to let go. So you got to deal with that. The boards, the executive directors, I'd have to say that's number one, because sometimes you can get into a power struggle with that.
So you're talking about egos or whatever they are?
Yeah. Egos can get involved. Yeah. Yeah. Definitely, without a doubt. I mean, everybody wants to be boss, and, there can only be one boss. But I have actually seen an organization, I did a merger a while ago, that they were both boss. They did.
There was one on Long Island that happened that
Yeah.
same way. Two very similar sized organizations coming together, and they formed a brand new organization, complementary. And the two executive directors co-ran the organization, and it worked effectively until one of them retired.
Yep, and that's a great way to do it, is just do co. The only thing is they have to have similar personalities to be able to do that. And because if they don't, then there'll be troubles down the road.
How do you identify an appropriate merger partner? So if I'm a nonprofit organization, whether I'm a buyer or a seller, how do I determine, or how do I go about? I mean, it's not like I put a for sale sign on my website, hey, for sale. I mean, what do I do? How do I identify who would be a good merger partner? I mean, do I work with an outside company to market me? Do I go out there and do some research and find which organizations I'd like to aspire to if I'm a seller, or which organizations are doing some cool stuff if I'm a buyer? I mean, how do I go about through this process?
So hopefully, if I'm involved, then I will help you do this homework. So it's doing research on organizations that are similar to you and complementary to you, doing the homework of where they're located, what do they do, and then after you have come up with your long list, then you create from there a shorter list. With the short list, then you contact them and you say, hey, I'm interested in doing a merger. What would you think? And the conversation is not that direct, but you know what I mean. So really
you want to merge with me?
I call you up. Hey, I want to merge with you. Do you want to merge with me? So so basically you contact them and say, are you open to a merger
or collaboration
or
some
collaboration,
yeah.
or something like that? Like, hey, let's grab a cup of coffee and let's talk about this. And then I suggest that you contact everyone on your short list. And, then you can weigh out your options of, well, okay, I have 5 people on my short list and they all want to merge, except for one. So there's 4 out of 5. Then you have lots of options. And there is actually funding out there that helps nonprofits merge. They will pay for your attorney fees, they will pay for new websites, they will pay for all of your operational cost. So I can help you get through that. But because those are things that you got to take into consideration also with this merger. So once you have that conversation and know that those expenses are paid for, because that's the first thing that comes to mind is we don't have the money to do this. Well, that equation's taken out now. So now you do have the money to do it. You just got to find the right partner. And the first thing you do is, like I said, create the short list, contact them, have the conversation.
So it should really be a proactive process.
Correct.
Yeah. And again, I think what tends to happen in most organizations, it's a passive process. Somewhere along the line, they make a decision. Oh, if something comes along, we'll look at it.
Yeah.
How does something come along?
Yeah.
So.
And to get down, I just want to go back to this, to get to your long list, to your short list, it's really advised to look at their 990s 3 years back, if not a little bit further, just to see how they've progressed. to
Yes, you're
see
looking
how
at trends. You're looking at operational trends.
they're looking
Yep.
at operational and financial trends. And you can do that without even picking up the telephone and talking to them. So,
GuideStar or the New York State
exactly. Go
Attorney
to
General's
GuideStar
office. Yep.
or, yep, either one of those. You can go there and you can look at them. And that really creates your list for you. And then you can, shorten it to get to your short list through that process.
Okay. How does an organization prepare itself for a merger? What's the process? How do they, go through the whole merger process?
So it's a long process, and just so that everyone's understood.
Just to put it in perspective, we have about 2 minutes.
Okay. So in my short 2 minutes, the process takes about a good year,
Okay.
if not longer. It is a very long process because of all the things that you have to analyze and that you have to streamline through. So you have to look at your organization, you have to look at theirs, you have to talk to all the staff to prepare everybody, you have to start doing your due diligence with each other. And it's a dance. It's a constant.
You have to look at regulations. You have to look at contracts.
Regulations, because the Attorney General of New York also has a say-so if you can merge with that organization. So it's really important to get the attorneys involved as soon as you can.
So if an organization wanted to reach out and speak to you, how would they go about getting in touch with you?
They can go to my website at www.triumphbc.com, or they can give me a call at 412-400-0887.
Awesome.
I forgot my phone number.
Thanks a lot, Danette. We really appreciate all your insight.
Yes, thank you very much
this
for
was
having
amazing.
me. Yes.
So tune in on August 29th for our next Cerini Nonprofit Connection, where our guest will be David Mahoney, a partner at the law firm of Silverman Alcampora. They will be sharing some insight regarding employment law related issues, which I know is a topic that the nonprofit sector is struggling with. Thank you for connecting with us.
Thank you.